Hello, welcome back to another video about Reflexis Flow. Today I'd like to pick things up where we left them in the previous video. We started talking about how to write your own flow parts, and let's do a quick recap of what we did in the first session. And then we'll take things from there. So I wrote a little editor part that can also act as a viewer. So it's a very small property editor, and it's not a static editor, it's a data-driven editor. So the application that we're working on right now actually has a mechanism where organizations can have properties set or assigned to them. So we started out with these 4 properties, but it could be any number of properties, and the properties have different types, like enums, text, and number properties. And what I did is I wrote a little editor part that is able to show you these properties or allow you to edit them. So let's have a brief look. I think if I go here's the first instance of the part that I wrote in the first session. So clicking different organizations will actually update properties. We can go here, so you can see the properties changing in this viewer part here. And I can actually go to the editor as well and change stuff. So let's do this, save it, and there's the change. So in the previous session, I pretty much concluded with the observation that the part as it is or was right back then wasn't really ready for production, because there are several things that we still need to work on. And that's what I want to do in this second video. And simply to show you how to come up with the first really decent version of the part, and what's involved, the mechanisms that we provide, and the things you need to think about, because like I said earlier, there are also security issues involved, and but I'll show you some of them later on. Okay, so this is where we were. This is the part that we created, and it's actually plugged into our flow in 2 separate locations. So this is the show organizations step that we're actually looking at right here. And obviously the second location is where the part functions as an editor. That's the edit organization props step. And I've bookmarked that location as well. So let's first deal with some functional issues. In the previous session, I showed you that if I enter A+ here and then click save, the A+ is lost, so the other changes would not be lost. Let's change this to 100 and change this back to PO. You see that these changes are picked up, but the A+ is silently dropped. So why is that, and do we really want that? Well, we don't want that. If a user enters something that's invalid, we don't simply want to drop it. We want to bring it to the user's attention and allow the user to fix things. So that's something that we really need to add to make it functionally somewhat okay. So why is it being dropped? Let's look at the source. So this is the part that as we've been working on. Let's fold the source a bit. So there's the regular present method, the process method. And there's a respond method. So present and process are used for basic synchronous operation. Respond is used pretty much in between for all the interaction that happens behind the scenes. And basically what we did is we enabled this part to refresh itself asynchronously, and obviously that's being used here in the viewer. If I click different organizations, it'll update, and it'll simply re-render with different data underneath. But what I want to tackle right now is this issue here. If I add ABC and would click save, the ABC is pretty much wiped out. And why does that happen? Well, that's pretty simple. We have this process method here. The process method looks at the definition of all the properties it should display, and then it loops over this definition. And for each of the properties that it wants to handle, it picks up the incoming value. It tries to pick up the incoming value. And what we did is we try to somewhat validate that value. That's something that's actually really, really, really important. You need to make sure that whatever comes in is being vetted, it's being checked. You need to make sure that you're not receiving any data that you did not expect. And so and in this case, for number properties, we added this check in the first session. And obviously, if the value is ABC, it's not a number, and so the value simply gets zapped. And because there's no feedback mechanism here, it's not being added to the result table, so it simply gets dropped. And like I said, this is not what we want. We basically want the part to say, hey, this is not okay, you need to fix this, or you should not save these changes. So how can we do that? Well, first of all, we need to make sure that we see the error. So that's one thing. And the other thing is we need to ensure that we remember what went wrong, so that if Flow decides not to step away, but stay on this particular step, stay in this particular screen, the user actually gets signaled that there's something wrong here. So we need to add something to the processing method to ensure that we see what is wrong, but we also need to provide information to the present method, or in our case the rendering method, so that we can add some clue to what's going on. So enough talking, let's get to some coding. I'm not going to handle all the different cases. What I'll do is I'll simply add the check for the number check here, and show you how you can provide the feedback to the user, and how you can ensure that it's not simply being accepted and being dropped. So what I can do is something like this, and then say, if it doesn't convert to a number, but we did have something here, a value, then, you know, obviously there's something wrong. But to make that happen, obviously, if nothing was entered, this value could simply be an empty string. So that's not what we need to check, or that's not something that we need to flag. So what I'll do is I'll move this up here. No, I'll say something like this. If it's a string, and it makes sense to trim the string. I should say something like trim the string. And if the string then ends up being an empty string, then we're pretty sure that there's nothing there, that the user didn't type anything. So I need to tell declare what sort of trimming. So we actually have two trim functions using the UTF-8 one that we provide, because it's a bit more rigorous in what it strips out. So with this additional code, I know that either I have a trimmed string or value simply nil. So I can do something like this. I don't need to do anything for text fields because we pretty much accept anything. I mean, you could have, you know, like different conditions that you'd like to implement, but for our use case, that's not a thing. So with these changes, I know that if we're here and the to number ends up if the to number conversion fails, then I know that something's up. And at this point, I need to remember the property for which it failed. So I also need to keep track of any errors. Let's call them simply fails or failed. And here I could say, so if this conversion failed, we know that we got something, but it's not a number. So here I can say this property failed. I could even say something like, oh, it's not a number. But yeah, that's fine. So like I said, for text it really does not matter. For numbers, we now detect that something that did come in is not a number. For this one here, for the drop down, we could add a check like if a value came in but it's not a valid index, then we could, you know, moan about it. But we'll leave that as an exercise because it's really not that important for what I want to show you right now. So once this loops, and you know, it will loop for these 4 properties in our case. This is an enumeration, this is a text field, and this is a number field, and this is a number field. So there are actually the 3rd and 4th field are possible candidates for stuff that go wrong. And what I now need to do is to ensure that if anything did fail, so if anything was put in this table, first of all that I signal upward, so to flow, that you know, things are not okay. So we can do it like this. A simple way to go about this is simply to check if the failed table is empty or not. So this is a quick way to do that. And here I assign the error field, and you know, well, you can put anything in here that you'd like, but setting it to a true value or a non-nil value will signal to flow that things are not okay. And well, let's see. Oh, I should probably make this a bit smaller. Yeah, 992. If not value, then all right. Okay. So let's see what happens. So we already see different behavior here, and what is different is that it does not step away. So I can click cancel here and it will step away, but if I go here, add in a incorrect value, click save, it doesn't step away anymore because we instructed Flow that sum things up. So this is the part where we say, okay, we flagged something that failed. So the failed table is not empty anymore. So you know, something goes wrong, and essentially when you signal to Flow that something goes wrong, it'll prevent your flow from moving to another step. So that's a good way to handle, well, form failures. Obviously, we're not done yet, and basically what we were saying right now, if I type ABC here and then click save, it won't step away, but it actually restores the original value, which seems a bit odd, and is probably not what you would expect. Why does this happen? Well, mostly because in the present method, so in the rendering method, it picks up the original data again. So the original data is not changed. So if you look at the flow definition as we're using it, so this is the metadata, this is the original data, and our changes are saved to a different location in the session context. So the session context is the sort of a temporary data space for your flow, for your session. And so we save everything that is okay in this location, but this location is unchanged. And it simply comes up with the original data. So and that's not, maybe that's not what you want, because you want the user to be able to fix what she messed up. Plus, there's no signal whatsoever. You know, it just, oh yeah, for this one, it just refuses to budge, but it's still here. And I'd like to have some sort of signal, some sort of feedback for the user. So that she knows that something's up. So how can we improve on this? Well, like I said, the process method is one thing, and the process method runs in the process phase, but we actually need to carry over some of the information that we collected. So actually this table here, to the present phase, because then the part will re-render itself. and we could actually, and since we know what fields, what properties failed, we could actually, for instance, add a class that would, color the field, or it's some sort of indicator that things are amiss. So an easy way to do this is to use our scratchpad mechanism. So the scratchpad mechanism is actually a variable, MyPart variable. So it's pad stands for scratchpad, and the MyPart means that it's really private to this particular instance of this part. And I can say, I can store this table in this scratchpad, in this private scratchpad. And this private scratchpad stays alive for as long as the user is looking at this page. So it's available during the present phase, during the respond phase, during the processing phase, and this actually is a good way for a part to move information for itself across the different phases. So you don't need to store anything in the context, you just assign what you want to remember to the MyPart table, and then you can use it whenever you need it. So this is the process method, and now we move to the render method, and I can simply pick things up here. I can say, okay, I want to access any information about previous failures, and obviously that information may not be present yet, because if the process method hasn't run yet, then this would be empty. So I need to add this. So now I know that the failed will always be a table. And now I can do the following. If failed p name. We actually have some. I think we actually have some predefined classes, and I'm going to use them, so I don't need to add any CSS. So incomplete is actually something that we that's already part of the basic flow distribution. And what I can do is add this class to, well, this number input, and see what happens. So, wow. For completeness sake, we could also put it here. Code still compiles, so that's fine. And well, let's see what's changed. If I now press save, I get a clue. So the value is not the value that we typed, but the clue is already there. So if we now can maybe ensure that the value stays the original value, then, well, we're basically there. So let's move back to the processing method, and add another table, and then we could say, well, for the final result, we basically store all the validated values, but for our purposes, we could store the value as it's coming in. And now I just need to make sure that I carry this over. And now we can use that, because I can see if we have original values stored in our scratchpad, and if there weren't any, we can read the properties as they were modeled, like here. But if this is available, we know that this is the data that the user entered previously, because that's why we kept it here. Oh, I need to highlight it. So, okay, let's see what it does. I'm changing this. Let's go for Utrecht 100 with an exclamation mark, and here the ZZC, and I'm saying save. So here, PO saved, Utrecht is kept, so it's not being restored anymore. And here my faulty values are available, including some feedback about the fields that were wrong. And now I can simply say, okay, sorry about this, let's try again. And now it says, okay, the 100 is okay, but this one is not. Then I say, okay, let's go for A+, and no, it's still not okay. But if I say, okay, sorry, I just need to keep this empty, then it says 1, 2, 3, which is not what I want. Okay, why is this? So it picked up all the values except the 1, 2, 3. Can't accept this anymore. Okay, interesting. Ah, yes. This one here is not good, because this only stores stuff when it's coming in. Ah, yeah, okay, I get it. It's not actually, well, first of all, let's put this here, because this is where it belongs. This actually has to do with the way the flow updates properties, because we actually did strip it, so it was not part of the result anymore. But the way the update mechanism works at the moment is if it's not there, it's not being changed, and that's not what we want. So I need to change this a little bit. And move this out. And say, okay, for anything that's missing, I'm putting in a value. So I'm what you see here is if there's nothing here, because for instance it was an empty string and I converted that to a nil, I still want to make sure that the property is set as an empty value, and that ensures that the changes are actually kept. So let's try again. Remove this, change this to 100 plus. Then it says this is okay, but this is not. So let's change this 101. Change this back to Nijmegen and move this to, and there we are. So with just fairly minor changes and using the the scratchpad mechanism, we were actually able to flag incoming data that's not acceptable. Then we made sure that if we did find anything that's not acceptable, we passed on the information to Flow, so Flow would prevent the user from leaving this particular step. That's what we did here. And finally, by storing this information in the scratchpad, we were able to enhance the rendering method and keep data that the user entered, and actually also signal invalid data using, you know, a simple class that we added to our input element. So that's the feedback mechanism, and it's actually pretty useful, as you can imagine. So let's move on to another topic. Sorry about the voice, it's still not okay yet, so I still don't sound like my usual self, but fortunately I don't burst out coughing every other minute. I'm using this to try and keep things smooth. So actually the most important topic to talk about is security, because you may think that, hey, this part is really moving along nicely, and in some ways it is, because there's a lot of functionality here. We moved from 100 or so lines, or nearly 100 lines, to 120 lines. So no, that's fine. It's a little editor. It's a viewer. It's functional. Unfortunately, it's also very, very wrong. And to show you, I'll just briefly demonstrate. So we'll go here. I'm clicking another organization, and what I'll do is I'll type something like Amsterdam and word. Boo-hoo. So this is just some text that a user might type. And let's put in a grade and press save, and let's see what happens. Interesting. I get this pop-up here saying boo-hoo. Let's click it away. Let's go here. Let's go back. Ooh, I get another pop-up saying boo-hoo. And there's the page. And I click something here. I click tourism again. These pop-ups are not okay. This is effectively a small demonstration of what's being called cross-site scripting, and somehow we did our best, and well, we actually created a big security blunder. Apparently, a user typed in something that now interferes with the regular operation of our web application. And obviously, having a little pop-up is a fairly innocent but annoying thing. But it actually could have been doing something very, very differently, and that's bad with a capital B. So if I now go back here, everything. Oh no, this is not the. I need to tourism. I need to click this away. If I now go back here, you actually see that the page itself is even messed up a bit, you know. So this is not what I typed. I typed this here, but the page is actually being corrupted and there's stuff going on here. So what happened? Well, we basically assumed that anything that the user typed was okay, but it's not, because the user typed in a piece of text with a script element inside it, and we simply took that text and stored it in our system, in this case simply in our session data space, what we call the session context, and it actually is also being stored in the database itself, the application database, by the way. So and here, as soon as the viewer part tries to read the property and simply prints what it has, the script element that the user type actually becomes active in our page. So again, this is a typical cross-site scripting demonstration, and the question now is, how do you deal with this? And there are actually several ways to deal with it, but and I'll briefly show you how we usually deal with it, and it's up to you to think about how you want to deal with it. But again, you need to be really aware that being naive and simply assuming that, oh, something's coming in, I'm going to store this, is not okay, because this is a fairly innocent demonstration, but you can really do very nasty things with something similar. Okay, so how are we going to fix this? Well, there are several ways to fix this. For instance, one way to go about it would simply be to try and detect anything that you don't want to be there. So in this case, you could say, oh, I don't want any, script elements in there, or whatever, and you can try and see if it's there, and that seems like a sensible approach, but at some point you realize that detecting all the variations of the stuff you don't want to be there, and all the stuff you need to filter out, can actually be quite hard. So what we usually do is try to take the sting out of the attack, because basically this is a web application attack vector. So, and one way to do that is this. I'm pulling in a set of library functions, and these are escaping functions. And what I need here, is the escape HTML function. So what I'm adding here is what I call an alias. So this is the official function. I could simply use this, but I like to use the alias. And well, let's look at the documentation for this function, because reflexis.com/docs, if I go here, escape HTML, I find the library function, and this is what it does. So it's inside web/escape, and it translates these characters to their HTML entity references. So what happens is it effectively disables their regular meaning inside HTML. And so if you're thinking about escaping and you want to add that to your part, and you definitely probably should, there are still two ways to go about it, because you could add escaping while you render, or you could add escaping while you, so rendering means while you generate the output. So then you basically say, okay, whatever the user typed, we're keeping it as is, and but while we plug it into our own pages, we'll take the sting out of, you know, whatever is present. That would be one way to go about it, but we'd like to do it the other way around and basically escape any data that's coming in, because and that means escaping the data during processing. And well, let's do that. Essentially, because here we're dealing with numbers, we're dealing with numbers for these properties as well. The only escaping that I actually need to do is this bit here. So that's a very, very small change, with hopefully resulting in a very big improvement. Let's see what happens. So everything still compiles, that's fine. The part didn't really get much any bigger. Let's go back to this value. And like I said, the page is actually messed up a bit. But let's try and well, first let's try and clear this entire thing here. Oh, that didn't work. Why not? Oh, yeah, sorry. It did work. But like I said in the previous session, the system actually has a mechanism that allows organizations to inherit any property. So the property for the location property for here was actually zapped, but that means that any location property on a higher level becomes active here. So that's good. So now let's go back to tourism and enter our very evil bit of code. And as you can see, we already did this several times. Let's go for the boohoo again. Boohoo. Let's change this. Grade 1. No. Just to see that things change. And this is already much better. Why? Because the pop-up is gone, and essentially we still see the text that the user typed, but it's not active anymore. And because we escaped things, the escaped version of this text is stored in the database. So whoever picks it up and does something with it doesn't need to be afraid that it will become active anymore, unless someone would unescape it first and then plug it into the page. So there you have it. A brief example of cross-site scripting and a quick demo of how easily it sneaks in, and some food for thought and about how you can deal with this, and a quick demonstration of how we deal with it and how easy it is if you deal with it. So basically I just required the escape function, created the alias, and made sure that any incoming text is being escaped before it's further processed. And that's all there is to it. Security issues. And once again, and I really cannot say this enough, you always need to validate and check and double check and really make sure that whatever data is incoming is actually, acceptable. And if it's not acceptable, drop it, lose it, whatever. But don't be naive. Don't simply think, oh, I put in a drop down with 10 items, and now I'm always going to receive, a selection 1, 2, 3, or 4, 5, or 10. You don't know what'll come back. Just because you put something in the page does not mean that the next request that's being posted to your web application conforms to the page that you created. So anyone can post anything to your web application, and it doesn't even need your page. So you really need to make sure that whatever you process is what you want to process. So never, always be wary of what you receive, and never take things for granted. Okay. Well, there are two other smaller topics that I still want to cover, well, let's have a quick look at how we can finish this part, because it's actually, from a functional perspective, pretty much up to scratch. It acts as a viewer, it acts as an editor. The editor, does some decent validation. It provides feedback if anything's amiss. But if I now, for instance, would fire up the flow modeler, usually we, as you've seen, we usually model our flows, using text definitions. But you can also model flows using our flow modeler. And if we fire up the flow modeler, let's do that. Excuse me. Let's go here. Let's open up the flow that we've been working on. And let's move to this step, show organizations, and see if we can find our part. I'm just going to move this here. Step, show organizations. Here it is. So this is the step. This is the definition of what you see right here. And if we now look at the parts list, then here's the viewer that we've been working on, or the editor, but it acts as a viewer here. If I now would try and edit this part definition, we do recognize these properties, but as you can see, these properties are all red, and it says unknown here. If I click here, it says unknown as well. This is not what you want to see. If I click another, for instance, this button, another part, you actually get a description of what the part does. I can click in these fields and the field help will update. And I actually get a nice list of all the properties that I can set. But if I go back to our editor, it's coming up short. Why? Simply because we did not provide any information to the modeler about the capabilities of our new part. Unfortunately, that's really easy to do, so I'll quickly show you how it can be done. Again, this is the structure we've been working on. So now we're going to add a new section in this part called the info section. And the info section is basically a table that can hold different description, different fields. So I can now come up with a nice description. Renders a simple property editor / viewer. If I save this, press F5, here's our description. So that's actually nice because this allows anyone who uses the part that we just created to actually, have a brief description of what it does. Now I want to provide some information about these fields and all the other properties that the part supports. So if I go here and I say list namespaces, then I can actually see that these are all the properties that we've implemented so far, and hopefully you recognize them. So there's definition for the metadata, properties for the data, mode to switch between viewer and editor mode, class to add your own, override your own styling, and the result property to instruct the part where to store its result. And so these properties in the info section are called fields, and each field is you can basically describe each field like this. So let's take it from the top. So we started out with definition. That's the first one we defined. So the type of property is definition. The definition property is actually simply a path. And also the definition property really needs to be there, because without the metadata, the editor is not capable of doing anything useful, at least not in the way that we wrote it. So there are the properties, the properties property, which is also a path, and that one is also required. We added the mode property to switch between the two different modes. So that's it's sort of an enumeration type. And the options, so the different choices for this mode were view, I think, and edit. And also we had a default mode, I think. Yes, we have a default class and a default mode. So the same thing for class. No, let's do the result first. Result is a path too. Result is not required because the result would be required if mode is edit, but it's not required when mode is view. So we'll leave things as it is. And let's see, the final bit is the class bit. I'll just say the property class is a class. Well, I didn't break anything, so that's good. And let's go to the modeler and refresh the page. And there you have it. We've actually added this little information section, which is basically, as you can see, just a nested table structure. And having this information is sufficient for anyone who is not a programmer to use this part, because here you can see, okay, these are two paths. Here's the mode. So I can switch the modes. Here's the result property, and here's the class. And anyone can fill in these properties now and use your part. So that's all about the info section and why it's there. If you want to know more about info sections and the different ways you can use them, it's probably a good idea to simply look at some of the info sections of our standard parts. And essentially, once you actually know how to read a part, once you recognize the structure, the different methods, it becomes much easier, and you can get a lot of clues on how to do stuff, and because some of the parts are quite nice and use some nice techniques to solve problems. All right, well, I think that nearly concludes our session for today. So the part has grown a bit, but it's also much more up to a production level part, I think. Obviously, there's all sorts of functionality that you could add, but that's not what this session is all about. There's one final last thing I simply want to mention. It's not really that important if you want to develop your own parts, but we tend to add it to as many parts as we can, and that's dealing with flow validation. So flow validation is basically a mechanism that enables you to analyze your flow, your entire flow, so all the steps, all the structures, all the parts, and flag anything that looks suspicious, because it's very easy to quickly model a flow and to build things incrementally, but it's also easy to miss stuff. For instance, for our part, there are some required properties. If you don't provide this, if you don't set this property or that property, this part is not going to be able to do its thing. So if you simply forgot to fill in this particular field here, one of these two, your flow is never really gonna work the way you want it to. So flow validation is one way to do the analysis and actually give you a report of what could be wrong. So some of the messages that you see are really fatal errors, and some of them are merely warnings. It's usually very hard to distinguish between them from a software point of view, not from a user point of view. But it's a good way to run a flow validation, and actually I can do a quick flow validation here, and you'll see that it actually comes up with several warnings, but most of them have to do with steps that are unfinished and still are being worked on. For instance, here's a step that used to be part of the flow, but we decoupled it, so it could actually be removed, and it's because it's not reachable from anywhere. And actually, yes, let's do a quick check. If I would comment this out, and so let's synchronize the flow, and I'll do a validation. Here it says, okay, for edit organization props editor, the property definition is missing. So and this is being flagged because we added an info section. Sorry about that. I'm toggling with the message buffer, playing around with the message buffer here. We added this info section and made sure to mention that, and Flow actually uses that to come up with this list of warnings and errors. So final bit I want to mention is that there's actually So while flow validation is very powerful and does a lot of things for you, you can actually have your own custom validation as with very specialized validation logic. Once again, this is the signature, but there's an additional argument here. And at this place here, at this point, you can implement any check that you want to implement. So previously, for instance, I said that these are the required properties, but the result property is not required while it's in viewing mode, but it is required for the editor mode. So this is a very, very specific custom case for this part, but because it's such a custom case, we have this, you can add this validate method to actually check for this scenario and flag the error. So I can now say, if self mode is edit and there's not a result, then then I could say property result needs to be set for edit mode. So didn't break anything, so that's good. Let's try it out. This is an edit mode, so instead of leaving out the definition, I'm now leaving out the result, or I could say resulting. I'm synchronizing, and now I do the validation, and now it says unknown property resulting, which is correct, and property results need to be set for edit mode. So I'm hoping that you'll see that this is a very, very powerful mechanism that allows you to make your own part very smart and make it really, bulletproof in ways that others can use your part. Because in the end, that's what the Flow platform is all about: to provide a structure for web applications. And to build solid solutions and reusable parts that can be used by anyone, not just the person who built them, are definitely a key component of that. Okay, well, that sort of concludes the demonstration in this second session of the Writing Your Own Flowpart series. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least that the information has been useful. There are still many more topics that we need to discuss, but we'll leave that for other videos. For now, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.